I was asked to make a few points about Indian economy and politics, and I've chosen the theme 19th century politics and 21st century economy. Can they coexist? And if there are some serious issues here, what can we do to make things better? If the 20th century offered us any lessons, it is that you cannot de-link economics from politics. The biggest question decided in the 20th century, we all know, was whether or not the socialist economy was right or the market economy was right. It's a central political question. Ultimately, we recognize that the economic growth of a country is not neutral to the political trajectory of that nation. And in 1991, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, in 89 when the Berlin Wall collapsed, in 91 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and much of the world embraced market economy, but with certain changes, certain significant changes, then the assumption now in the world is that humankind has discovered what works best in terms of economic growth and political organization. But I think we all should recognize that it's not an unadulterated victory of market economy. The market economy won because they have actually absorbed some of the socialist principles. In the first half of the 20th century, education and healthcare were not regarded as government's business. But in the second half of the 20th century, almost every major country in the world of any consequence embraced both education and healthcare as part of government's business. The services may be provided by the private sector, but it must be driven by the public sector. That's the broad understanding. In a very, very fundamental sense, it is this synthesis of some of the socialist principles with the market economy that made the success of market economy possible. Therefore, I would like to start off my presentation with a brief discussion on the role of state. What is it that the modern state should be doing? Instead of debating whether it should be socialist or market-based, what is the role of the state? In India, this question has now been adequately addressed. I would like to argue that the state is primarily meant for public order, justice, and rule of law, apart from the defense of the realm and so on and so forth. And then it must be essentially to enhance the capabilities of the citizens of the society so that the accident of birth, accident of the womb, as Warren Buffett called it, does not determine the fate of a child, and that is education and health care. And then, of course, infrastructure required for a modern economy, in particular, transport and power sector, because communications, thanks to all of you guys, the government's role is now very marginal except minimal regulation, really. And then natural resources development, there's no way anybody but a state actor is going to do something like Tennessee Valley Authority or a Hoover Dam. It has to be a government's business. And finally, social security, a measure of social security so that those who fall into the cracks, their concerns can be addressed in a humane, modern society. Once we look at state and its role with greater clarity in this manner, I think a lot of questions can be addressed much better. The economic story of India in the past 10, 15, 20 years is by now reasonably well understood across the world. In 1947, we started with 2% of the global GDP, if there is something called global GDP. But not too long ago, in human history terms, about 3 centuries or 4 centuries before that, India's share of the world economy was something like 25%. But over a period of 150, 200 years, because we did not really take advantage of the Industrial Revolution, India fell to 2% of the global GDP. By 1991, this fell down to 1% of the GDP. The economy in India grew at a snail's pace, but in terms of the global economy, our share came down to 1%. In 1991, as we all know now, the current Prime Minister, as Finance Minister of India, in the wake of an enormous crisis, out of compulsion, not conviction, engineered a near U-turn in our economic policies. Today, we are back at 2% of the global GDP. In other words, we ran very hard for 63 years to remain where we were, in relative terms. Not that India hasn't progressed at all, but we still are where we were in 1947. But the general perception is, with reasonably good growth rates, though still not matching China's, and with some evidence of sustaining those growth rates, India could well be one of the major economies of the world in the next few decades. The Emerging Markets Forum says by 2039, if India does a few things right, we could well be the second largest economy in the world. That China will be the largest is more or less accepted now. I think there are very few people in the world who think that anything else is possible now. But the future, of course, may tell us a different story. Whether India will actually fulfill her potential is a great challenge. My argument is, India has the potential to achieve this miracle, but we have to make this miracle happen. Our politics has become now a great impediment to economic growth and to fulfilling India's potential. If you look at politics of India in the past 60 years, there's a huge success story. At one level, India is the first country in the world to embrace universal adult franchise on the first day that the Constitution was written. For a largely illiterate and extremely poor country to embrace adult franchise on a universal basis from day one was actually a great adventure. It was an enormous expression of faith in the wisdom of the bulk of the people of the country. In this very great country in which we are right now, the first republic in the modern world, the first democracy in the modern world, the first country to practice separation of powers, the first country with a written constitution, despite recognition that all human beings are equal, it took them something like 144 years after those immortal words were written in the Declaration of Independence to recognize that women are equal to men. It took a civil war and the sacrifice and the blood and gore of more than 10% of the able-bodied youth of this country to recognize that people of another skin color are the same as any other skin color. Given that context, and given the fact that Britain took centuries before women got the right to vote in 1928, it was actually a remarkable expression of faith on the part of Indian constitution makers to recognize that all Indians, irrespective of caste, religion, language, and we have many, many, many languages. Even here, I'm sure many people do not realize how many languages there are in India. Serious languages with thousands of years history, hundreds of years history, their own literature, their own script, and their own unique culture. Despite all this, and despite the fact that India was actually partitioned on the basis of religion, the Indian constitution makers put enormous faith in the people of the country. And in some respects, I think that faith is fully vindicated. If you take India's political evolution, it's a remarkable success story in the sense that A, we retained our political freedoms. B, there is intense electoral competition. Elections in India are not make-believe elections. C, the winners do not punish the losers. There are many countries in the world where the loser is punished merely because he lost the election. He may lose his head or liberty or many things. In India, that never happened, mercifully. And finally, the elected government is truly in authority. It's not some coterie or janta. Going by these four postulates, India is a truly vibrant, functioning democracy. And that we could actually maintain a moderate rate of growth in the economy and now emerge as a reasonably influential country in terms of the future economy of the globe, it's a source of some satisfaction. But the fact is, there are also many dark corners of Indian politics. And unless they are set right, unless we throw light over them, unless we change that, we may not fulfill our true economic potential. Particularly because India is largely poor and because most people are still illiterate, because politics is seen as a power struggle without any reference to ideologies, or any outcomes, because there's increasing contention in politics, but there's only change of players and there's no change in the outcomes. There's no change in the rules of the game. Money has become the currency of politics. For those of you from the United States, it may appear that it's a very normal thing in politics. After all, in the US, they spend a lot of money in politics. But these are two different worlds altogether. The money spent here is entirely for legitimate campaigning purposes, most of it for television advertising. It's fully accounted, and it's transparent. Sadly, much of the money spent in elections in India is unaccounted and for illegitimate purposes, mostly for vote buying with money and liquor. So the market economy actually works in politics of India, and that's what ought to be changed. The second perversion of Indian politics is, in a country of abject poverty, it's very easy for the governments to seduce the voters, offering them all kinds of freebies, unsustainable in the long term, very detrimental to public good. But in the short term, there's always a way of persuading the voter that a free power, free color television, free rice, and every month some amount of money, irrespective of everything else, that will be given once the government assumes office. I'm not mentioning these things as casual. These are all real sops offered in India by political parties. Some of them actually were delivered. There's a state of Tamil Nadu where every family was offered a color television, and they were actually delivered in a significant measure. I don't know how many were delivered finally, but millions of color televisions were delivered by the elected government as part of the promise that they made to the electorate before election. So increasingly, parties are resorting to this kind of thing, taking advantage of the poverty. The third is, of course, in a very diverse country with many primordial loyalties, it's very easy to divide people on caste, region, religion, and language, and mobilize them as voting blocks without a sense of what's in it for me if I vote for this party or that party, because there's no sense that any party would make any difference, and therefore there's only emotional purchase available. Once we have these three attitudes in politics, which are increasingly dominant in the mainstream political parties, we have a serious crisis. We have elections, we have peaceful transfer of power, we have fierce contention, we have liberty, but the electoral outcomes are simply not what India needs. And that's what ought to be changed. And therefore, my argument is that this kind of a 19th century political mode, a medieval political mode, where politics is really about power struggle, where we master the art of getting into power without bothering about the outcomes, that cannot be coexisting with the 21st century economy. One of them has to give way. Either politics must change or economy will eventually decline and collapse. What will happen depends on what we do in the next 10 years or so in India. A comparison with China would be very apt because many people obviously are interested in the two Asian giants. In terms of population, we are number one, number two respectively. In terms of growth rates among large economies, now China is number one and India is pretty close to being number two. And in terms of potential, India could well emerge as one of the economic giants of the world in the next 30 years if we do well. So obviously comparisons are inevitable. But I think one has to understand things in perspective. One argument often advanced is that China is not a democracy, therefore they can do pretty much what they want, and therefore they can actually focus on accelerated economic growth, even at the cost of short-term political price. Because after all, one of the great challenges of democratic politics anywhere in the world is the conflict between the short-term political price you have to pay for pursuing right policies and the long-term slow rate of social payoff. It's one of the most difficult things anywhere in the world. That's why we all love to hate politicians, because politicians have to wrestle with this all the time. They have to reconcile conflicting interests and satisfy all groups, and they have to be mindful of the short-term political price and yet focus on the long-term public good. These are awesome challenges. Obviously, in a dictatorship, you don't have these problems. It's easier. Nevertheless, I think we are overstating the case when we try and say that democracy is detrimental to economic growth. I would like to argue that almost everything good that happened in China is actually because of democratization of society. And almost everything bad that happened in China after their 1948 revolution was because Chinese leadership on occasion acted autocratically and in an arbitrary manner. take the later case, the Great Leap Forward. Between 1959 and 62, because of Mao Zedong's utterly irrational policies, arbitrary policies, 20 million Chinese starved to death. 1959 to 62. It was not because of any sensible policies. The autocracy of China actually caused perhaps the greatest man-made misery in the 20th century. Similarly, the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. It was again another leadership blunder. But the good things that happened in China were because they tried to democratize education, healthcare access, decentralization of power, technology to villages, enhancing productivity. These are all tools of democratization. An authoritarian leadership actually enhanced the content of democracy. We always think in terms of democracy as merely voting. Democracy is more than that. We have in India great liberty. But are we a democratic society fully in some respects? I suspect not. In some respects, I dare to argue that China is perhaps more democratic than India. You take the local governments in China. They are far more influential. There's far greater decentralization of power. There's greater citizen empowerment at that local level than in India today. Everything in India revolves on the Prime Minister, the Chief Minister at the provincial level, and the district magistrate at the district level. The citizens and the communities and local governments have hardly any role at all. Similarly, education, healthcare, the essence of a modern democracy, have never been given the kind of importance that they deserved in India. What I'm arguing is the normative democracy in terms of constitution and elections are necessary but not sufficient. We have to actually have a functioning democracy in terms of society being democratized, in terms of people's future being decided not by the accident of birth, accident of the womb, but by their hard work, and the society must give an opportunity for everybody to fulfill her true potential. In that sense, we have a lot to learn from China. This categorization, crude categorization of something is a democracy, something is not, based merely on certain indicators, is not sufficient. And India must learn with humility the art of democratization of our society. If that is the case, what are the things India should do? I'll come to the concluding part of my presentation so that we can have some time for meaningful interaction. Because I'm making a controversial point, I'm aware of that. And I think it requires some serious examination. First is local governments. One great thing that happened in India is a maturation of federalism. India is a multilingual country. In your northern neighborhood in Canada, after all, there's only one other language apart from English spoken by the Quebec people, the French language. And yet every 5 years or so, there is a demand for secession, and there's some kind of accommodation for the time being, and we never know when Canada is going to break up. You see a tiny country like Belgium, for instance. Again, 2 languages, and every other day there is a fight breaking out. Right now I'm told that there is no government in office there. They're figuring out who should be the Prime Minister. You see Sri Lanka, our own southern neighbor. There's only one other language, Shimhala language, the main language of the country. And the minority northern Tamils, they spoke the Tamil language. And because the country did not know how to reconcile the linguistic aspirations of these 2 groups, there was a bloody civil war. Tens of thousands of people died. One of the most murderous terrorist groups was on rampage for decades. And only recently, they have been able to overcome the terrorist group. And hopefully, they have learned the lesson. And now, the indications are that they are trying to follow the Indian model of federalism. In India, in contrast, there are at least 18 major languages. It's not like China where Mandarin is spoken and understood by 85% of the people, and all the other ethnic nationalities, apart from Han Chinese, they are only 15% of the people. In India, the largest language is spoken only by about 40% people, 40 to 45% people, Hindi. In that, again, there are so many dialects that Bhojpuri is different from the chaste Hindi of, let's say, Bhopal or Indore. And the other language, second biggest language, Telugu, is spoken by about 8.5% of the people. All other languages are now of that order, 8%, 6%, 5%, etc. And yet, despite having 18 languages, each of them with their own literature, their own culture, their own tradition, and their own history, for centuries, some for millennia, India could actually unite all of them and our federalism today matured. When the Constitution was written, while we were a federal country, it was actually quasi-federal. The federal government was more in command because the founding fathers were terrified of the possibility of further balkanization of India, given the experience of partition of India in 1947. But over the past 25 years, one of the great things that happened in India is this federalism has now become very mature. The states have come into their own. They have now considerable leeway in deciding things and in presiding their own destinies. But the tragedy is the states in turn have not recognized the need to encourage local communities to be self-governing. Despite a constitutional injunction, and we have huge amendments in 1994 running into 7,700 words. If you compare that with the American Constitution, the whole of American Constitution today, some 222 years after it was written, it has some 7,400 words. Our provisions relating to local governments alone, they run into 7,700 words. And yet we created overstructured, underpowered local governments, and the bureaucracy, of which I was a member for a long time, the state legislatures, of which I am a member currently, these two have conspired to ensure that the local governments are enfeebled. There is absolutely no desire in India to really empower the communities and to see that the people can preside over their own destinies. Unless India recognizes the merit of decentralization in a very complex and vast country, we will never be able to deliver services. Without local government empowerment, you cannot have a linkage between authority and accountability. You cannot have a clear understanding in the minds of the people between their vote and public good that results from that. And most of all, you cannot have a link between taxes and services rendered. And therefore, there will be always a reluctance to pay taxes. In India, tax avoidance is a national sport. I'm sure many of us dislike to pay taxes. But in India, we really elevated that to a very high quality sport. Our tax GDP ratio, even today, is only about 18%. That means only 18% of the GDP is collected by any government at any level, federal, local, or state, towards taxes. Compare that with the United States. It's about 40% in this country. Go to Europe, most countries are 50%. Some countries are 60%. Now, we may not have to go to 60% and 50%, but to actually have a decent functioning state to fulfill its responsibilities, the tax rates must go higher. There must be greater tax compliance. That will never happen as long as the bulk of the people of India do not see the link between the taxes they pay and the services they get. And therefore, there will be always a move towards getting something on the quick. There will be always a desire for short-term maximization. Let me get some freebie, this rice or this free power or this free color TV, because I know this is something tangible that I get. And I don't know what else I'll get anyway. Therefore, that's all I expect from politics, and let the country be damned. If that is to be changed, people must see where the tax money is going, and they must understand the alternative uses for the tax money. For all these reasons, we have to empower the local governments, the way, for instance, China, despite being an autocratic regime, has actually been trying to do. The second major change required is rule of law. Normatively, India has an impeccable system of rule of law. The judiciary is independent. The Supreme Court is pretty strong, perhaps not as strong as the United States, but next to US, probably our judiciary is the strongest in the world. We have many independent constitutional organs, like the Election Commission, the world's most powerful election commission, the electoral oversight body, and many other organs. But nevertheless, the rule of law is pretty weak. The norms are different from the practice. The police are entirely under the control of the political executive in almost every state of the country. We cannot even conceive of a situation like that happened in Illinois state in your country, when Rod Blagojevich, when he tried to sell the senator's appointment for a price, he was promptly thrown out of office. He is probably politically buried forever, and he may even go to jail. If you apply that standard in India, I'm afraid about 95% of us would be found wanting. And unless we actually create a system where there's a fierce independence of the crime investigation authority, anti-corruption agencies, and independent prosecution, and speedy justice. Our justice system is independent, but it's very, very slow and ponderous. I don't want to go into details as to what needs to be done. There are simple, elegant answers to that. I myself, as a member of the Administrative Reforms Commission, have specifically come out with a series of proposals to bring about significant changes within the bounds of our Constitution. So the answers are evident, but we have to actually apply them so that the culture of VIPs, very important persons, the culture of cronyism, the culture of patronage, the culture of those in power determining all outcomes, even in justice system, and even in terms of crime investigation, unless we change these things, we are in serious trouble. After all, the strength of a market economy is that the market operates equally for everybody. It's a level playing field. And if the contracts are not honored, if those in power decide what will happen, who the next billionaire is going to be, and those who actually do business in India are worried about how to enforce the contracts, then obviously there'll be a serious setback to businesses. The third big change we require is to fight corruption. Corruption is obviously prevalent in many countries. Blagojevich case shows in America is no exception. But in countries like India, it's ubiquitous. It is universally believed that if you want to do business in India, you have to be corrupt. Countries like the US have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is now later adopted by the European Commission, and eventually now has become United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Nevertheless, the fact is in many countries, if you want to actually do serious business, unless you please those in government or in politics, you cannot move forward. And unless that is changed, I'm afraid Indian economic growth will be stalled. If you want to contain corruption, again, the answers are self-evident. What you have done to Rod Blagojevich in this country must be possible for everybody in India. Speedy justice, confiscation of properties, throwing them in jail, getting them out of politics, those who are corrupt, and creating a mechanism for political campaign finance. We have an excellent law on campaign finance in India enacted in 2003. Lok Satta movement, and I was privileged to be a part of that, is largely responsible for bringing about that law. It's an excellent law. In the United States, for instance, in the wake of Watergate in 1970s, you brought in the campaign finance reform law after Nixon's resignation. But since then, for about 40 years, there's been no serious change. And then came, for about 35 years, and then came the Feingold-McCain law, which is actually a feeble legislation to improve the campaign finance system. India has arguably one of the finest campaign finance laws, except that it's simply not implemented. The parties don't care about it. Ours perhaps is the only party in India which goes by that in letter and spirit. Unless we make it mandatory to actually implement that, and unless vote buying ceases, we are in serious trouble. But meanwhile, we have to address the challenges of corruption by institutional mechanisms, by creating an independent, strong anti-corruption agency, an independent prosecution, by punishing swiftly and surely the corrupt people, by setting a strong example, punitive example, and by doing several other things that many other countries have successfully done to curb corruption substantially. Finally, politics is all about incentives, just like economics. If in a poor country like India, vote buying is what gets you to the winning post, I suspect many people will continue to buy the votes, many people will continue to sell the votes. If the buyer and seller are happy, no law, no constitution can really set that right. We have to change the incentives. The Indian electoral system is a legacy of the colonial Britain. It's not at all a rational system. It's utterly irrational. I believe Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, actually argued in favor of other models like the American presidential system and the European proportional representation system. But the Indians said, no, we are more British than all of you guys. We'll have to persevere with your own electoral system, even if we get rid of you. And it's actually happening today. In Britain, except in the House of Commons, in every other election, they have given up this old-fashioned first-past-the-post system. In the regional parliaments of Scotland, Northern Wales, and Ireland, the system is proportionality-based. In local elections, it's proportionality-based. European Parliament, proportionality-based. London City, an elected executive, an elected mayor. Right now, Boris Johnson, as you know, is the mayor. Earlier, the first mayor in this new mode of election is Ken Livingstone. India is the only country that's sticking with the old-fashioned British Westminster first-past-the-post model. It appears that Britain may actually be changing that to the House of Commons level also. We all know what happened in the last week when the two parties, for the first time after the Second World War in Britain, headed by Cameron and Nick Clegg, they now joined forces to form a coalition government. And eventually, in the next 2-3 years, we may well see in Britain a shift to some form of proportionate representation. The reason why India requires a shift is, if one vote extra means victory, one vote less means defeat, in an abjectly poor country where the political culture is already considerably damaged, vote buying is rampant. Vote buying will continue, corruption will continue, politics will be distorted. We have to change it to a system where a few votes this way, that way don't matter. It's the percentage of votes you get. It's not how much you control a constituency. As a local zamindar, as we call, a local chief, a man with complete clout, complete domination of the local population. That's what really gives political dividends in India today. We have to change it to a system where it's the image of the party and the candidates and the platform of the political party, rather than the inducements offered to individuals to get the marginal vote, that will determine the political outcomes. If we do these things, then we could have probably changed India's political system from the 19th century archaic model to something approximating the 21st century, and our economy and our politics can coexist. Einstein once said, 20th century is characterized by perfection of means and confusion of ends. Indian politicians have mastered the art of acquiring power. They perfected the means. But what power is about in terms of outcomes is something that eludes us all the time. There's hardly any change in respect to what happens, no matter who is in office. And that's what should be changed in India. I believe Indian people are alive to these challenges. They're capable of addressing them, but they require a nudge and push from all over the world, wherever compatriots of Indian compatriots are there. People of Indian origin are there. The businesses in India or Indian businesses, they must argue for change, because they must not think politics is different from economics. There is a notion in business circles that what we do business is unrelated to what kind of politics takes shape. Politics has a decisive influence on the way businesses take shape, on the way economic growth trajectory takes shape. And unless we address the larger questions of politics without being partisan, without really getting into who should be in power, but focusing on what should be the outcomes, unless we do that, economy itself will be in peril. Indian businesses are now slowly awakening themselves to this reality. We require to change fundamentally. I believe we will change. When status quo is unsustainable, change is inevitable. That's why the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. It did not fall because of any bullets or warfare. It fell because the people voted with their feet, because they could see the contrast between what's happening across the borders, across the wall, and in their own society. And they could not take it any longer. And no society could repress its people forever. And a democratic society certainly will change when people want it adequately, but people must be awakened to the possibilities of change. But the danger is, change may still happen, it may not be the right kind of change. 20 years ago, there was a very popular story in Moscow. I believe hundreds of people were queuing in front of a ration shop for a few crumbs of bread in Moscow city on a bitter, biting, cold winter morning. They waited and waited, but there was no bread in sight. One young man lost his temper after some time. He said, "I'm sick and tired of it. I'll go and kill the general secretary in Kremlin." And he stormed off in protest. The others still waited patiently because there was still the midnight knock, there was still the secret police, the Gestapo or whatever they called it in Soviet Union. There were still the concentration camps, the gulags. Therefore, they all waited very quietly and patiently. This young man came back after 2 hours. The others still were waiting, and there was no bread in sight. They all gathered around him and asked him, "What happened? Have you killed the general secretary? Is there a riot in Kremlin? Can we rob this store now? Our children are hungry at home. Please tell us what happened. What happened?" This young man said, "I went there to kill the general secretary, but there was a much longer queue waiting there." This story was recounted in every single household of Soviet Union, in all the 15 republics at that time. People laughed about it, but they did nothing about it. Change did come in 1991, but not the kind of change any Soviet citizen wanted. Change will always come. It will always overtake us eventually, every society. The challenge is it the kind of change that we all need, we all desire, and that will be positive? Or is it a change we'll have to submit ourselves to and pay the price for? That's the challenge facing Indian people, Indian politicians, Indian civil servants, and Indian businessmen. I believe we are capable of rising to the challenge and fulfilling our potential and becoming one of the great economies and one of the most moderating influences in the modern world in a complex, ever-changing, unpredictable world. But only if we set our house in order today. And I believe the stakes for the world are as great as they are for India, because what happens to 1/6 of humanity cannot but impact the rest of the world. And I believe the rest of the world is actually waiting for this caged lion to really find its own feet and find its own direction. And I believe ultimately 21st century economy and 21st century politics will coincide and show the way to many other countries in the emerging economies which continue to believe that economic growth and political freedom cannot coexist. We have to prove that these two can and must coexist. The challenge in that sense is fundamental and it's human. Thank you.